This sixth class, we are in the middle of part 2 of the Kitab-i-Iqan. And last time we introduced one of the major themes of part 2 of the Iqan, which intertwines with several other major themes, but the sort of overarching major theme is the question of the continuity of divine revelation and the question of well, isn't it the case that all revelation has ended? Isn't it the case that Muhammad is the last prophet? Isn't the hand of God chained up, as Baha'u'llah accuses some of the Jewish divines of claiming, and the Muslim divines, even worse, of claiming that their prophet is the last ever prophet? And so a great part of this second part of the Kitab-i-Iqan is in direct or indirect answer to this question of the finality of divine revelation. Is it really final? Baha'u'llah, of course, makes the core claim, which is, one could say, the core theological claim of the Baha'i Faith, that divine revelation is not a one and done phenomenon in the world, or even a few and done, but it's something that stretches infinitely far into the past and will stretch infinitely far into the future, in space as well as in time, in a manner which is dynamic and evolutionary and not fixed. So Baha'u'llah addresses this question of divine finality by pointing out that in a number of places in the Kitab-i-Iqan, in a number of places in the Quran, and then referred to many places in the Kitab-i-Iqan, there is a promise of something which seems to be in the future, the attainment to the divine presence, which is a future state of affairs. And probably the Muslims of his day and the Muslims up until that point didn't read that promise of attainment to the divine presence as the promise of another prophet to succeed Muhammad, because they already believed that Muhammad was the final prophet. And we're going to get to the ground zero of this issue in a bunch of slides, where we see where exactly in the Quran this misunderstanding arises, and how it's so interestingly paired with this promise of attainment to the divine presence, which seems to contradict, if Muhammad sealed the prophets and yet we're promised to attain the divine presence in the future, well, what could that mean? And Baha'u'llah talks about, well, what could attainment to the divine presence mean? Well, it could mean three different things, he says. One thing, it could mean attaining the essence of God up in that unreachable realm, which being unreachable, it can't be attained. So he kind of discards that as a possibility. And we can have in our mind the three tiers of the ringstone symbol. And then the lowest, that's the top tier. And then the lowest tier of the ringstone symbol represents all of the world, all of creation. And if attainment to the divine presence means attainment to this presence of God, which is infused through every atom of existence, then he says, then that wouldn't be a future state. It would be an everyday state. It would be a past, present, and future state. And so Baha'u'llah says that couldn't be what is meant by attainment to the divine presence. So that leaves, Baha'u'llah says, the middle tier of the ringstone symbol in Baha'i terms, which is attainment to the divine presence must mean that there will be future manifestations of God, future prophets of God, each of which in their own unique way are placeholders for, or signposts for, guide the way towards, and are the incarnation in a way of that divine presence. So that is a big chunk of what's going on in part 2 of the Kitab-i-Iqan. And in the process of doing that, he talks about this attainment to the divine presence as something, because it's something that's happened in the past and will happen in the future. It participates in a kind of cyclicality. There is a repetition of pattern in sacred history. You could say the Baha'i concept of revelation is that sacred history rhymes. There's a periodic reappearance of that self-same spirit, accompanied by the self-same followers and opposed by the self-same deniers and so forth, but clothed in a different garment, that different garment being the particular laws and ordinances which are relevant to the day. But it goes even deeper to that. That garment also includes theological conceptions which people have erroneously assumed are themselves unchanging. And we find that the theologies can shift between time and place, whether we're looking at a strictly monotheistic theology, or whether if we go far enough back in time, there weren't any monotheists. All theologies were pantheons of gods. And if you go across, far enough east, you find cultural zones in which monotheism is not the dominant theological position, but something which is more non-theistic, but still very much in the realm of the sacred. So one finds a repetition of pattern, and an example of that, which we went into some detail, is this repetition of the followers of each prophet who are all transmuted by this divine elixir. The divine elixir is this enigmatic thing in the Baha'i writings, which itself is a manifestation of this repetition of pattern, because there's a something going on in the physical world in which base matter can change or be transmuted. This may refer to processes known by physicists. It may not, but that transmutation of matter, there's a repetition of that pattern at a higher degree, which is the human domain, which is that being touched by the word, that the penetrative power of the word which transmutes the copper of the soul into gold. So and so also wrapped into this discussion of the return of the prophets is, it begs the question, well, why is it that prophet A is so different from prophet B? Why is the message of Muhammad on its surface so different from the message of Jesus, which is so different from the message of Moses? When you're trying to argue that this is the same thing, it's the same prophet who returns. So Baha'u'llah has to propose that there are essentially two stations that the prophets occupy. There's a station of abstract unity, of essential oneness, through which lens we talk about the oneness of the prophets, and through which lens any talk of distinction is a form of blindness, really. But complementary to that is this station of distinction, in which each of them is clothed in a different garment of a different name and a different culture and different laws and so forth. So this time we're going to be looking at paragraphs 171 to 210, and we're going to be continuing on this theme of the twofold stations of the manifestation. In particular, we're going to be concluding the section on the oneness or the unity of the manifestations with symbolic interpretations of various theological concepts. We get right to the heart of this question of the seal of the prophets and Baha'u'llah's answer to that. And we also have some other interesting themes that arise along the way. The infinitude of creation, how all of our theological conceptions are fundamentally limited. Something very beautiful as a side point about the significance of our countenance and our bearing. And then we move into the second station of the manifestations, the station of distinction, through which they all are founders of different religions. And we'll find that this has that some of the arguments under here, particularly the argument about the nature of prophetic knowledge, has implications for our conception of the relativity of religious truth and the relativity of the knowledge that the prophets possess. So as before, we're going to be following this outline more or less as we walk through. And as you've noticed, the outline isn't entirely linear, because the nature of the topics introduced is not itself entirely linear. Just to re-highlight a couple of the key passages from last time in paragraphs 161 and 162, which are really the heart, I think, of this of the introduction of this theological position about the nature of the prophets. That they each have a twofold station is given in paragraph 161. In paragraph 162, he says, from this perspective, he said, should one of these manifestations of holiness proclaim, saying, I am the return of all the prophets, he verily speaketh the truth. So then Baha'u'llah goes on and talks about the return of the followers of the prophets before coming back to paragraph 171, which is our starting point, to this point about the return of the prophets and the oneness of the prophets. So it's already been introduced in paragraph 162. He returns to that point here in paragraph 171, referring to a statement of the Bab that likens the manifestations of God to the sun. This is not footnoted, but it's interesting. I'm almost sure that this refers to a passage from the writings of the Bab, which is translated and published in that one volume of selections from the writings of the Bab that we have. Liken the manifestations of God unto the sun, which though it rise from the beginning that hath no beginning until the end that knoweth no end, is nonetheless the same sun. Oh, I put it down in the footnotes there. Selections of the writings of the Bab, pages 105 to 106. Now wert thou to say that this sun is the former sun, thou speakest the truth. And if thou sayest that this sun is the return of that sun, thou also speakest the truth. Likewise, from this statement it is made evident that the term last is applicable to the first, and the term first applicable to the last, inasmuch as both the first and the last have risen to proclaim one and the same faith. So further on this theme of them all being the first and the last, how many are those through failure to understand its meaning? This fact that first and last applies to all of them have allowed the term seal of the prophets to obscure their understanding. Then he quotes Muhammad himself in various hadith, saying things like, I am Adam, Noah, Moses, and Jesus. I am the first Adam, being capable of saying also, I am the last Adam. And so likewise with the seal of the prophets, he says that that is applicable to that divine beauty. It is admittedly obvious, admits that test unto mankind. So it's a problem of beginning, end, first, last, and seal. But he says that wert thou to soar in the holy realm of God was alone, there was none else beside him, thou wilt find in that court all these names, first, last, beginning, end, so forth, utterly non-existent and completely forgotten. These are all relative realities. And in the station of abstract unity, these various distinctions are forgotten. Then he has a bit of a digression onto a phrase that has been an issue among the divines and doctors of the day, which is the phrase "veils of glory," and this, I believe, is connected to the idea of the clouds of glory, and of Jesus coming down in the clouds of glory, which can be interpreted to mean that he'll come kind of with full manifestation of power versus the clouds hiding him. You know, which way does it go? Baha'u'llah here interpreting the phrase of veils of glory, he says, these are the divines and doctors living in the days of the manifestation of God, who, because of their want of discernment and their love and eagerness for leadership, have failed to submit to the cause of God, and they have even refused to incline their ears unto the divine melody, having thrust their fingers into their ears. And he chastises them for their excellence of apparel. He says, if numbers and excellence of apparel be regarded as the criterions of learning and truth, the peoples of a bygone age, whom those of today have never surpassed in numbers, magnificence, and power, should certainly be accounted a superior and worthier people. You know, we could be referring to the Roman Empire. We can be referring to the ancient heights of the Persian Empire. Certainly, the clergy of Baha'u'llah's day and the civilization of Persia in that day was a faint shadow of its former glory. So among these veils of glory that are the veils between people and the truth, he says, is this term seal of the prophets. He says, but he quotes a few passages that call into question whether passages like this should be interpreted as a one-time only thing, or whether the concept of seal, these spiritual concepts really can be thought to extend in multiples. One example of this being a hadith that says, 1,000 Fatimas I have espoused, all of whom were the daughters of Muhammad, son of Abdullah, the seal of the prophets. So if there's 1,000 Fatimas, then shouldn't there have been 1,000 seal of the prophets to go along with them? He says, behold how many are the mysteries that lie as yet unraveled within the tabernacle of the knowledge of God, and how numerous the gems of his wisdom that are still concealed in his inviolable treasuries. And this provokes this beautiful statement about just the infinitude of it all, and how much we're limiting ourselves. And when we take any of these concepts, any of these spiritual ideas, and try to confine it to a particular point in space and time and say, this is the only time that this thing ever happened. Just as there are 1,000 Fatimas, as in the words of Muhammad himself in the Hadith, he says, shouldst thou ponder this in thine heart, thou wouldst realize that his handiwork knoweth neither beginning nor end. The domain of his decree is too vast for the tongue of mortals to describe, or the bird of the human mind to traverse. And the dispensation of his providence are too mysterious for the mind of man to comprehend. His creation no end hath overtaken, and it hath ever existed from the beginning that hath no beginning. And the manifestations of his beauty no beginning hath beheld, and they will continue to the end that knoweth no end. Ponder this utterance in thine heart, and reflect how it is applicable of the infinitude of it all. It's something Baha'u'llah is a little bit prescient in saying this. Some of the ancient philosophers also contended that the universe was endless. Other philosophers would say the universe has a boundary. Baha'u'llah is saying this in early 1860s. It wasn't until much later, with the advent of modern cosmology at the beginning of the 20th century, that we actually had the physical evidence of just how massive our universe is. The notion of stars being distant was known already to the ancient Greeks. Just how distant was a matter of some debate until modern science. But no one had any inkling that all of the stars that we see in the sky are just a tiny little local region in an island universe of stars, which we now call galaxies, which themselves are just tiny motes of dust in an ocean of countless other galaxies. This explosion of our physical universe and the erasure of all of the conceptual boundaries, sort of outward in space, and then also outward in time. In a sense, our knowledge of the vastness of the universe in time is also only a modern discovery. The great age of the universe and the enormous future that lies in front of us. But this, I think, folds into the theology of the Baha'i Faith in an important way, because it shows how any theological conception is just too small for the universe. The universe is just too big for our notions of gods, our notion of the divine working through history, particularly what the Muslim divines of Baha'u'llah's day would have been saying, that divine revelation, the point of contact between the divine and this vast physical world should have ended at this year of the death of Muhammad on the Arabian Peninsula, of this mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam in this vast ocean of galaxies. It just doesn't make sense. There must be more worlds than we can conceive. Those other worlds must also be, in their own way, receiving the light of the divine sun, just as they receive the light of the physical suns. Because that light of the divine sun is infinitely emanating, it must fall upon infinite numbers of creatures and infinite numbers of planets. And there's beautiful statements by Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha about that very fact, that there must be creatures on other planets that also are capable of asking these fundamental questions. And in that light, how can we take this, any concept of finality seriously, particularly as it applies only to this limited world? So I have here a number of interesting quotations also from the Baha'i writings about the eternity of the universe. I'll just read this one, which is a provisional translation from a great tablet of Abdu'l-Baha called the Tablet of the Celestial Spheres, or the Loh Aflakiye. He says, know that the expressions of the creative hand of God throughout his limitless worlds are themselves limitless. Limitations are a characteristic of the finite, and restriction is a quality of existent things, not the reality of existence. Just as particulars are infinite in number, so are universals on the material plane, and the great realities of the universe are without number and beyond computation. The worlds of bodily existence, the mind of no man can reckon, nor the understanding of the learned comprehend. Consider the following well-known tradition and examine its meanings, indicative of the vastness of the cosmos and its awesome, limitless expanse. God, exalted be he, fashioned 100,000 lamps, and suspended the throne, the earth, the heavens, and whatever is between them, even heaven and hell, all of these in a single lamp, and only God knows what is in the rest of the lamps. Just as the luminous spiritual worlds are sanctified above computation or limitations, so too are the physical worlds in this vast immensity of space. I can't help read this and not think multiverse. That, you know, if you take everything that we know and sort of put it in one lamp, and then say, well, there may be other lamps, but who knows what's in those lamps? It seems to nicely define the idea of a multiverse. So other quotations, which I'll leave for you to come back to if you want to. So Baha'u'llah then refers to the failure of the people to apprehend the meaning of attainment, the true meaning of attainment to the divine presence, and its implications for the inevitability of there being future prophets of God that will come subsequent to Muhammad. And the way he does it is very interesting. He points to the Quran itself and where their reading of the Quran is so limited. So this is paragraph 181. He says, how strange. These people with one hand cling to those verses of the Quran and those traditions of the people of certitude which they have found to accord with their inclinations and interests, i.e., the verse on the seal of the prophets, and with the other reject those which are contrary to their selfish desires, i.e., the ones about attainment to the divine presence at some point in the future. Believe ye then part of the book and deny part? How could ye judge that which ye understand not? Even as the Lord of being hath in his unerring book, after speaking of the seal in his exalted utterance, Muhammad is the apostle of God and the seal of the prophets, in Quran chapter 33, verse 40, hath revealed unto all people the promise of attainment unto the divine presence. And that's 4 verses later on in chapter 33, verse 44. So let's look at this is the Quran translation by Abdullah Yusuf Ali. And here are verses 40 through 44. So this is the famous verse that has been such a cause of blindness on the part of the Muslim divines, that Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but he is the messenger of Allah and the seal of the prophets, and Allah has full knowledge of all things. And the footnote to this just shows the sort of the typical interpretation that Muslim divines of the day, and Abdullah Yusuf Ali is one of them, give to this verse, that the Holy Prophet Muhammad closed the long line of messengers. And when a document is sealed, it is complete, and there can be no further addition. He says, Allah's teaching is and will always be continuous, but there has been and will be no prophet after Muhammad. The later ages will want thinkers and reformers, not prophets. And what Baha'u'llah is pointing out to the uncle of the Bab is, if you read just a little bit further, here in paragraph 44, in verse 44, and of course it's not translated in a way that brings it out, because that's not how the translator understood the verse. He says, their salutation on the day they meet him will be peace. At least it's in the future sense, and you have this idea of the day of meeting. But that's what it says in the Arabic, Yoma yalqunahu salaman, the day in which by which they meet him, they will say peace. So this is the promised attainment to the divine presence, which is right there almost alongside the statement of the seal of the prophets. So Baha'u'llah says, through the mystery of the former verse in paragraph 182, they have turned away from the grace promised by the latter. Despite the fact that attainment unto the divine presence in the day of resurrection is explicitly stated in that book, it hath been demonstrated and definitely established through clear evidences that by resurrection is meant the rise of the manifestation of God to proclaim his cause, and by attainment unto the divine presence is meant attainment unto the presence of his beauty in the person of his manifestation. But so great is the folly and perversity of this people that they won't listen, even if it is made clear to them, because they failed to realize, he says, all this time, that in every age the reading of the scriptures and holy books is for no other purpose except to enable the reader to apprehend their meaning and unravel their innermost secrets. There's something underneath the surface that needs to be understood. And that's what requires these allegorical and symbolic interpretations of these various phrases and ideas. So he says, it came to pass that on a certain day a needy man came to visit this soul, Baha'u'llah, craving for the ocean of his knowledge. While conversing with him, mention was made concerning the signs of the day of judgment, resurrection, revival, and reckoning. He urged us to explain how in this wondrous dispensation the peoples of the world were brought to a reckoning when none were made aware of it. Another variation on the question of the Bab. How is it that all these things happened and nobody knew that it happened? It's kind of like, how did the resurrection of Christ happen, and how did an earthquake, happen on the moment that Jesus gave up the Spirit, but it's not recorded anywhere in history? It's a similar sort of a question. And Baha'u'llah answered, he said, hast thou not read the Quran, and art thou not aware of this blessed verse? On that day shall neither man nor spirit be asked of his sin. They said, don't you realize that by asking is not meant asking by tongue or speech, even as the verse itself doth indicate and prove? For afterwards it is said, by their countenance shall the sinners be known, and they shall be seized by their forelocks and their feet. So this judgment that happens, these momentous things that happen in the spiritual realm, are things that are invisible to the eye, are things that no one comes up and asks you about it. No one says, hey, here it is. But the reality of it is manifest in the in the change it produces in those that recognize it, and those who are there at that time. He says they're not judged in the sort of external sense. They're judged by the very expression on their faces, by their very countenance and bearing. He says the peoples of the world are judged by their countenance. By it, their belief, their faith, and their iniquity are all made manifest. Abdu'l-Baha says this. There's a cute little story about this in a Roald Dahl book, which I haven't read, but I found it somewhere on the internet, that if a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on the face. And when that person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts cannot ever be ugly. You can have a wonky nose and a crooked mouth and a double chin and stick out teeth. But if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like sunbeams, and you'll always look lovely. I think Abdu'l-Baha says pretty much the same thing in his tablet to his aunt, who writes to him. His aunt was a supporter of Mirza Yahya. A little bit of backstory to this tablet. This is just a provisional translation, and basically defends Mirza Yahya's claim. And Abdu'l-Baha, one of Abdu'l-Baha's arguments to his aunt about Mirza Yahya is look at his countenance. So beyond what he says and whether it makes sense or not, look at his countenance, look at his bearing, look at his actions. In other words, look at the fruits that come from one's supposed declaration of belief in this or that. He says, were one to observe matters with but scant attention, the rank and station of every soul could be plainly read from his conduct and bearing. wert thou to consider the motion and stillness, the merits and attainments, the exaltation and abasement of the souls, and to examine their conduct and bearing, the inner reality of every soul would become clear and evident, and no need would remain for any further proof or evidence. It's an amazing statement and a little bit scary to me, because am I showing in my countenance and my conduct and bearing the thing that I claim to believe?
No.
Thanks.
Yes.
Oh, thank you, honey.
You've got us all here, so you're doing something right.
It also makes me wonder, one thinks of hidden spiritual bank accounts, right? You know, the catalog of all the great things you've done is something which you take with you, and no one knows what that is. This seems to argue against that a bit. It says, look, whatever you've done is going to be written upon your very bearing. It sort of takes away it kind of locks in a relationship between the physical and the spiritual in a way that makes me think about it slightly differently. So he's finishing then this part of the Kitab-i-Iqan, which is the argument from the perspective of the oneness of the prophets. He seals his theme by basically saying, God calleth to the abode of peace, and he guideth whom he will into the right way, sort of leaving it in God's hands, really, whether you understand what he's saying. But he says that we have variously and repeatedly set forth the meaning of every theme, that perchance every soul, whether high or low, may obtain, according to his measure and capacity, his share and portion thereof. Should he be unable to comprehend a certain argument, he may thus, by referring unto another, attain his purpose. So this is great comfort to when we read this book, and some paragraphs we just aren't getting, and so we just kind of skip through them, or it just seems to be too detailed or doesn't mean anything to us. That's okay. That's actually a feature, not a bug. And the idea is that somewhere in this book are going to be the ideas that draw us closer to the truth. And those paragraphs that don't draw us closer to the truth, maybe they're going to draw someone else closer to the truth. But he promises us that this bird of heaven, now dwelling upon the dust, can besides these melodies utter a myriad songs, and is able, apart from these utterances, to unfold innumerable mysteries. Perhaps one of the clearest instances of potential veiled declaration in the Iqan. Let the future disclose the hour when the brides of inner meaning will, as decreed by the will of God, hasten forth unveiled out of their mystic mansions and manifest themselves in the ancient realm of being. So on to the next station of the manifestations. He said, we've already in the former pages assigned 2 stations unto each of the luminaries arising from the day springs of eternal holiness. One of these, the station of essential unity, we've already explained. No distinction do we make between any of them. The other is the station of distinction, and pertaineth to the world of creation and to the limitations thereof. In this respect, each manifestation of God hath a distinct individuality, a definitely prescribed mission, a predestined revelation, and specially designated limitations. Each one of them is known by a different name, is characterized by a special attribute, fulfills a definite mission, and is entrusted with a particular revelation. Even as he saith, some of the apostles we have caused to excel the others. To some God hath spoken, some he hath raised and exalted, and to Jesus, son of Mary, we gave manifest signs, and we strengthened him with the Holy Spirit. Very interesting that he singles out Jesus after saying some apostles we have caused to excel the others. There's an unpublished tablet where Abdu'l-Baha talks about divine cycles and progressive revelation. And he says, and I can only paraphrase it, but it's relevant to this theme. He says the fact that revelation is progressive does not mean that each subsequent revelation in time is superior in all aspects to the revelation that came before. So progressive revelation is not a straight line. It can, it has an upward direction, but you can have peaks and troughs within that overall upper direction. And Abdul Ghazali says, he says, the revelation of Jesus. He said that revelation, he says, was of special magnitude. He said the brightness of that revelation was especially great. And he said, and its greatness was not seen again in the world until this latter manifestation, referring to the manifestation of Baha'u'llah, which leaves.
Can you start, Stephen? Can you just talk a little bit more about this? I feel like we're kind of blowing through, like, what does this differences in station mean? Does that mean like one prophet of God came to the island of Java in 50,000 BC and will never be known again, and others will be followed by billions? What do you think Baha'u'llah is meaning by this?
Quite possibly, there is a more recently available tablet which I think might cast some light on this, and it's in something called 12 Table Talks given by Abdul Aka. But he corrected them with his own hand and signed off on them, and so they have more of a status. They have a higher status than Pilgrim Notes, high enough that the World Center put them in here along with the other tablets.
Are these published anywhere or just online?
These are online, not yet published in paper, to my knowledge. So the very first one is.
Can you put the link in the chat below, please?
Yes, it's called The Three Kinds of Prophets. Question was, how many kinds of divine prophets are there? And the answer is there are three kinds of divine prophets. We're used to hearing about two, like the minor ones and the major ones. The minor ones being like biblical prophets like Jonah or Isaiah. He says there are three kinds of divine prophets. One kind are the universal manifestations, which are even as the sun. Through their advent, the world of existence is renewed, a new cycle is inaugurated, a new religion is revealed. Souls are quickened to a new life, and east and west are flooded with light. These souls are the universal manifestations of God and have been sent forth to the entire world and the generality of mankind. Can't be that many of them. Another kind of prophets are followers and promulgators, not leaders and lawgivers, but they are nonetheless the recipients of the hidden inspirations of God. I think to name those, some letters of Shoghi Effendi make more clear. Letters on behalf of Shoghi Effendi name some of those minor prophets. But here, and only here that I've seen, Abdu'l-Baha goes on to say, yet another kind are prophets whose prophethood has been limited to a particular locality. And locality here could also be translated as village in the original Persian. But the universal manifestations are all encompassing. They are like the root, all others are as the branches. They are like the sun, all others are as the moon and the stars. So you have implicitly here the idea that there's a difference in station between those individuals who are called in various ways to the station of prophethood. But it's really an amazing statement, and I think incredibly opening to consider that there are prophets whose prophethood has been limited to a particular locality or town or village. It certainly absolutely opens it to the entire, sort of fragmentary prophetic, let's say, we wouldn't call it prophetic, but the spiritual histories of indigenous peoples throughout the world who, not having the benefit of a written tradition, may only have a fragmentary oral tradition that's been passed along. And this gives place to that. It allows us to fully embrace and validate that as part of the whole divine story of humankind, which is at some point in some way on a global level and in some way at a local level and in between. So you said it's because of this difference in their station and mission that the words and utterances flowing from these well springs of divine knowledge appear to diverge and differ. Otherwise, in the eyes of them that are initiated into the mysteries of divine wisdom, all their utterances are in reality but the expressions of one truth. As most of the people have failed to appreciate those stations to which we have referred, they therefore feel perplexed and dismayed at the varying utterances produced by manifestations that are essentially one and the same. it seems to me this forces us to think differently about the content that the prophets bring. Because if we think of the content of, say, the Bible, the Quran, etc., as spiritual information, as knowledge of the next realm, knowledge of whatever, God literally wants us to do, ABC, the blueprint. If we think about it in those terms, then it's very difficult to reconcile one text against another, especially when they go entirely cross purposes with regard to certain social laws, what you can and can't eat, the nature of God, the nature of the manifestation. Muslims don't have a sense of Muhammad nearly as exalted as, say, Baha'is and Christians do. Muslims and Jews, actually, their idea of the prophet is more like, this is a man who is called by God, who, otherwise is a fallible human being. Although not so much, I think Muslims have a more exalted idea than the Jews have for Moses, and Baha'is and Christians have an even more exalted idea of it. So, but all of these are part of the.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Sorry, Stephen. Two things come to mind. I was talking to a Jewish friend about the Baha'i Faith, and I mentioned Moses in the pantheon of manifestations, and he laughed. He scoffed. Mm-hmm. He's like, Moses is one of 20 minor Old Testament, Jewish Bible prophets that did certain things. There's no, King David is maybe even above Moses, and mm-hmm. But when you think about Moses, like, he wrote the 10 Commandments, he revealed scripture, he mm-hmm. guided them out of the wasteland, he did a hell of a lot, number one. And number two, it's interesting you say that about Muslims, and it's true. They say Muhammad is the prophet of God. The Quran is what has all the power in Islam, right. Not Muhammad. He's just the vessel right. that revealed this thing called the Quran that has all this power. But also at the same time, if you insult Muhammad and draw him or make a cartoon, they'll, mm-hmm. oftentimes there can be a lot of violence about it. So it's very interesting that at the same time, there is a sacredness about the holiness of his body and presence.
Yeah. Thank you.
I guess I'm saying that also for any thought, if you have any thoughts on that, it's just kind of from my experience.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case, and so there's such differences, not just in terms of different religions' take on whether the prophet is essentially human or essentially divine, whether they can sin or not. I mean, Moses sinned by killing a man and hiding his body in the sands of the desert, and later was raised up as a prophet. Baha'u'llah mentions this in the Iqan as a great test to people, because how can a prophet be a person who committed a great sin? But there's also a great difference in the sense of, to what extent are they exemplars that we could even potentially be like? And this is where, say, you have the idea of Buddha as the prophet of Buddhism, which is the perfect exemplar. You want to be like Buddha, and you can be like Buddha if you follow the Eightfold Path and go all the way to the end. Whereas Baha'is don't have that same conception about our prophet. We have Abdu'l-Baha for that, who's infinitely, as Shoghi Effendi says, infinitely far below in station. So they're all so completely different from each other, and their writings are so completely different from each other, that I think that it seems to me what the step one has to take to see the unity behind the difference is realize that what they're doing and what these words are doing are not so much conveying information, but singing a song, like a song of the spirit, in different modes, in different styles, but equally elevating. And the point of it is the elevation of spirit and the transformation of spirit that results from it. That's what makes them all the same. Not that one of them says you can marry this many wives and the other says you can marry that many wives, and one says you can eat that and the other. You're never going to find the common thread. The best you'll come up with is something like the Golden Rule. You're not even going to find love. If you look for love in, say, the Quran, you're not going to really find it. You're going to find God's justice, but you're not really going to find so much about God's love. So you will find the golden rule, but beyond that, I think you have to look into the more abstract realm of how is this elevating the spirit, to find that common language that they all speak, and to find that that point of unity. He says it is evident that all these divergences of utterance are attributable to differences in station. Thus, viewed from the standpoint of their oneness and sublime detachment, the attributes of Godhead, divinity, supreme singleness, and inmost essence have been and are applicable to those essences of being. And this is one thing that the Muslims have a major issue with Baha'u'llah. When in so many places Baha'u'llah basically claims to occupy the station of the divine essence. So does the Bab, by the way, both of them. And the Bab does this even more than Baha'u'llah, actually. An Allah, I am God, he says. An al-Haq, I am the true one, over and over again. And Baha'u'llah says it's from the perspective of their unity that you hear them talk about their being equivalent to the essence of being. It says, through their appearance, a revelation of God is made manifest by their countenance. The beauty of God is revealed. Thus it is that the accents of God himself have been uttered by these manifestations of the divine being. There's a tablet by Abdu'l-Baha, which is a explanation for why Abdu'l-Baha, at the head of all of his tablets, writes Hovallah, which, if anyone's heard tablets chanted in feast or whatever, you always begin with Hovallah. If it's a tablet by Abdu'l-Baha, it's kind of a giveaway that that's a tablet of Abdu'l-Baha that's coming, because Abdu'l-Baha begins all of his tablets with Hovallah, he is God. And someone asked Abdu'l-Baha, why do you say he is God in the front of every tablet? And he said, because the point I'm making is that the manifestation is the he. I'm not saying God is God. I'm saying he, Baha'u'llah, equals God as far as we're concerned, and that's all from the station of essential unity, not literally, but from the station and through the lens of their essential unity. He is God. He said, viewed in the light of their second station, the station of distinction, differentiation, temporal limitations, characteristics, and standards, they manifest absolute servitude, utter destitution, and complete self-effacement, even as he hath said, and this is in the Quran, I am the servant of God. I am but a man like you. Muhammad says this in the Quran itself. But in this beautiful paragraph, in paragraph 196, this is quoted in Gleanings. He says, were any of the all-embracing manifestations of God to declare, I am God, he verily speaketh the truth, and no doubt attacheth thereto. And were any of them to voice the utterance, I am the messenger of God, he also speaketh the truth. And were they all to proclaim, I am the seal of the prophets, they verily utter but the truth. And were they to say, we are the servants of God, this is also a manifest and indisputable fact. They can say all of these things, all from these different standpoints. He says, thus in moments in which these essences of being were deeply immersed beneath the oceans of ancient and everlasting holiness, or when they soared to the loftiest summits of divine mysteries, they claimed their utterance to be the voice of divinity, the call of God himself. Were the eye of discernment to be opened, it would recognize that in this very state, they have considered themselves utterly effaced and non-existent in the face of him who is the all-pervading, the incorruptible. Even though they're saying, I am God, at the same time, they recognize their utter nothingness. Methinks they have regarded themselves as utter nothingness and deemed their mention in that court an act of blasphemy. For the slightest whispering of self within such a court is an evidence of self-assertion and independent existence. In the eyes of them that have attained unto that court, such a suggestion is itself a grievous transgression. And another veiled declaration in this short little paragraph. In this day, the breeze of God is wafted and his spirit hath pervaded all things. Such is the outpouring of his grace that the pen is stilled and the tongue is speechless. I imagine a pause after this before he reveals the next paragraph.
Hey, Stephen, I have a question. And I never quite know how to answer this. I was looking at the Bible the other day, and Jesus throughout the Bible calls himself the Son of Man. This Son of Man, this I am the Son of Man. The Son of Man says, I mean, like dozens and dozens and dozens of times, and refers to God as the Father. But never really says I'm the Son of God. But of course, we have the story of the virgin birth, and I imagine it was Paul who said, you know, for God gave his only begotten Son. But how do Christians think about that? Jesus calling himself the Son of Man, and then the title, the Son of God, becoming so important in the mythology of Christianity.
I don't know for sure. I want to say that the phrase "Son of Man" was something from the Old Testament, and when Christ attributes that to himself, he's implicitly claiming a very high station for himself for those who've read the Old Testament. The reason I say that is because over the last week, at the advice of an old Baha'i friend of mine, I binge watched the first three seasons of The Chosen, which, if you have the time, I actually recommend it. It's a very straightforward, literalistic telling of the Bible, of the stories of the New Testament, of the Gospels. The story of Jesus and the apostles gives everybody a backstory, adds a little humor, brings it up to date. Aspects of it Baha'is might find distasteful, as we would not want to depict our prophet in a dramatic sense. But if you can bracket that out, and you can actually, I think, enjoy and be moved by some of these stories. And I remember at one point, Jesus, whenever Jesus speaks in this, whenever he says something important, and I checked in various places, it's pretty much directly quoting from the Bible. So the director and screenwriters have tried to do a pretty good job of pulling in all the content of the New Testament and reproducing it with some fidelity. And I remember the character Jesus in the story at some point, he calls himself the Son of Man, and the Pharisees around kind of gasp in horror at him calling himself that. So on that very flimsy basis, I think there may be some back sort of story to that from the Old Testament. I don't think he means literally I'm the son of I'm born of humanity. I think it's a spiritual title.
Well, I did the obvious thing and looked it up on Wikipedia.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to do this.
Thanks.
No consensus on the issue has emerged among scholars of his usage of this, and he says it 81 times.
Wow.
Only when he's speaking. And it's the equivalent of the Hebrew expression "son of man" or "ben Adam," which appears in the Old Testament 103 times. So it is a mirror of the Old Testament, although no one can really agree on what he's meaning by going back to "son of man." But anyway.
I'll take a leap off of a very long branch, and suggest that, going back to my favorite topic of the circle of existence, and a statement by the Bab that the primal will is its own generator, is the cause of its own existence, and the primal will is kind of the ocean of which we are the drops. So all of humanity are like drops of the primal will. And the primal will is its own cause in a way. God is too exalted to be the direct cause of things, and so creation is in a way its own cause in a kind of chain of self-causation. In that sense, humanity has a very exalted station spiritually. Humanity collectively as one of the higher manifestations of this primal will in the world. And I'll go even farther on the tip of an even larger branch and suggest potentially that the creative acts of humanity and of conscious beings throughout the universe are in some way generative of the universe itself, in a way that reshapes and reforms things. But anyway, that's take that as a starry-eyed possibility. So Baha'u'llah goes on and says, by virtue of this station of their oneness, he says, they have claimed for themselves the voice of divinity and the like, whilst by virtue of their station of messengership, they have declared themselves the messengers of God. In every instance, they have voiced an utterance that would conform to the requirements of the occasion and have ascribed all these declarations to themselves. Declarations ranging from the realm of divine revelation to the realm of creation, and from the domain of divinity even unto the domain of earthly existence. Thus it is that whatsoever be their utterance, whether it pertain to the realm of divinity, lordship, prophethood, messengership, guardianship, and this is not the Baha'i guardianship, but the velayat, the guardianship of the concept in Shiite Islam, apostleship or servitude, all is true, beyond the shadow of a doubt. And I put this one in, especially highlighted this, because the idea that these utterances all conform to the requirements of the occasion, as a Baha'i, I sort of take this as, this is the usual stuff, we're used to hearing this, but I'm trying to abstract myself, try to put myself outside and sort of read this from the outside. I can imagine an objection to this being something like, oh, so the prophet basically says whatever they want to, and they don't have to be consistent, because they can always say, well, the circumstances dictated that I said this here and I said that there, and circumstances dictated that the previous prophet said this other thing, which is totally contradictory to what I'm saying. It's a way, you could argue that this is a way of papering over contradictions and just saying, well, I release myself. Each prophet can say, I release myself from the constraint of consistency, because I can always completely garble the message or spin out all these contradictory ideas and say, well, it's just a requirement of the occasion. And I think it's worthwhile to look at various other statements where Baha'u'llah has made similar sorts of statements, because it's so core to the Baha'i conception of divine revelation. It's so core to our idea of the relativity of religious truth. And it is I think it is the kind of master key to the future unity of the religions of the world. Because how else are you going to reconcile these contradictory creeds, contradictory social laws, and contradictory theologies if it wasn't by something like this? Something like the prophets indeed say very different things because the needs of the age are different. And the way to get to the unity of them is to abstract above all of the theologies and all of the laws and teachings and all of the blueprints and all of the do's and don'ts to that higher level of spiritual ecstasy, which is the outcome of following the spiritual path in all of these traditions. In the Iqan itself, earlier in the very first paragraphs of the Kitab-i-Iqan, Baha'u'llah references this idea of the conforming to the requirements of the occasion in his discussion of spiritual sovereignty, which he says he has set forth in accordance with the capacity and receptiveness of the people. In the Arabic hidden words, Baha'u'llah says, all that I've revealed unto thee with the tongue of power and have written for thee with the pen of might hath been in accordance with thy capacity and understanding, not with my state and the melody of my voice. In Gleanings, in a couple of places, he says, these principles and laws, these firmly established and mighty systems have proceeded from one source and are rays of one light. That they differ one from another is to be attributed to the varying requirements of the ages in which they were promulgated. Same thing that he was saying in the Iqan. It is clear and evident also in Gleanings, therefore, that any apparent variation in the intensity of their light is not inherent in the light itself, but should rather be attributed to the varying receptivity of an ever-changing world. Every prophet whom the Almighty and peerless Creator hath purposed to send to the peoples of the earth hath been entrusted with a message and charged to act in a manner that would best meet the requirements of the age in which he appeared. And Abdu'l-Baha, referring back to the Bible, says, in the dispensations gone before, the feeble body of the world could not withstand a rigorous or powerful cure. For this reason did Christ say, I have yet many things to say unto you, matters needing to be told, but ye cannot bear to hear them now. So Baha'u'llah says they have all these different utterances then, but you should seek for a unity. And if you have any questions, Baha'u'llah says what you should do. He says these words uttered by the luminaries of truth must needs be pondered, and should their significance be not grasped, enlightenment should be sought from the trustees of the depositories of knowledge, that these may expound their meaning and unravel their mystery. For it behooveth no man to interpret the holy words according to his own imperfect understanding, nor having found them to be contrary to his inclination and desires, to reject and repudiate their truth. So this is a very challenging thing. He's not saying go figure it out on your own. He's saying if you can't figure this out, ask the trustees of the depository of knowledge, because only they are qualified to tell you what this means. Why would Baha'u'llah say this if he's trying to give the sort of spiritual responsibility to all of us to go and find the truth, independent investigation of reality, opening paragraph of the Kitab-i-Iqan. But here he's saying, if you need to know the truth, ask someone who's qualified to give you the answer. My guess at what Baha'u'llah is getting at here is what he's trying to tell the uncle of the Bab is that Baha'u'llah himself is that trustee of the depository of knowledge. That it's another veiled assertion of Baha'u'llah's own station, that from which station he is giving all of these explanations of the meanings of things. So instead of saying, ask me because I can answer it for you, he's saying it in more abstract, in more sort of third-person terms. And then he says, because those trustees of the depositories of knowledge, i.e. the divine manifestations, have all the answers, they have all the knowledge. He's not talking here, however, about information knowledge. He's not talking about the facts of matter A, B, or C. He's talking about divine knowledge, as he makes clear in the next paragraph. He gives the example of Muhammad being the possessor as one of these trustees of knowledge who knows these things. He gives an example of Muhammad being asked a question, Muhammad giving an answer, the people objecting to his answer, the clamoring, saying, "Lo, an ignorant man who knoweth not what the Spirit is, calleth himself the revealer of divine knowledge." Well, what knowledge is this referring to? The word in the original is ilm, which might make you think, oh, this is that sort of information knowledge versus the erfan, which is the more mystical knowledge. But you have to see the phrase in which he's discussing the knowledge that is possessed by the divine manifestations. It's ilme laduni, which is knowledge by presence. It's knowledge by proximity. It's knowledge by virtue of being right up against the thing. And the Hansberry Dictionary explains that this is knowledge imparted directly by God through mystical intuition and Sufism. So this usage of divine knowledge that Baha'u'llah is giving here is equivalent to erfan. So he says, whatever proceedeth from these minds of divine wisdom, these treasuries of eternal knowledge, is truth, and not else but the truth. The saying, knowledge is one point which the foolish have multiplied, is a proof of our argument. And the tradition, knowledge is a light which God sheddeth into the heart of whomsoever he willeth, a confirmation of our statement. So in all these cases, if you look at the original Persian, it's ilm, but in this context, he's really talking about erfan, I believe. Now, up until the end of our reading for this evening, he then moves into an extended takedown of a fellow by the name of Haji Mirza Karim Khan Kermani, as an example of someone who doesn't possess knowledge. So he's contrasting Muhammad and everything and the divine knowledge that he possesses, the divine knowledge that the true trustees of knowledge possess, against this fellow, Karim Khan Kermani, who claims that he has all the knowledge of things, has convinced a lot of people that he has this knowledge. And as we find out from Wikipedia, but also other Baha'i sources talk about it, but this is a convenient. Also, he gives a nice picture of him. Looks like a nice chap. He was a Sheikhi Shia scholar, third leader of the Kermani Sheikhi community. So he was in charge of the community that followed Sheikh Ahmad and Sayyid Kazem. So very close to the Baha'i Faith. The Bab, of course, also was a follower originally of Sayyid Kazem, attended some lectures of Sayyid Kazem. It was
wasn't that Mullah Hussein that took over after Sayyid Kazem? No?
No, Mullah Hussein was not the successor of Sayyid Kazem to my knowledge. It was someone else. I think Mullah Hussein was probably too young. He's young upstart but he was also attending the same, like you can Google this as I'm talking and prove me wrong. But I believe he was attending the same lectures as the Bab was, both in the presence of Sayyid Kazem, when Sayyid Kazem was sending all of his followers out, to look for the promised one, and that's how the Bab ended up seeking out the Mullah Hussein ended up seeking out the Bab and finding him at the gates of Shiraz. So Karim Khan Kermani then was the first. He was the first. It says here in this article, among the first Shaikhi scholars to have rejected the messianic claims of the Bab. He wrote a dozen anti-Babi books, but had somewhat of a following of his own. So Baha'u'llah had to respond to this man who had written so much against the Bab, and who had such claims to knowledge. And it's very interesting that he says, we noticed, so Baha'u'llah said he perused some of his writings, and says, we noticed that he had enumerated some 20 or more sciences, the knowledge of which he considered to be essential for the comprehension of the mystery of the Mi'raj. And the Mi'raj was the night ascent of the Prophet upon his steed Buraq, which supposedly took place from the roof of the Dome of the Rock, unto heaven one night. And which is why the Muslims considered the Temple Mount in Jerusalem to be such a sacred place, because it's associated with this night journey of Muhammad. So it's interesting that Baha'u'llah mentions this, that Baha'u'llah notes that Karim Khan Kermani had enumerated 20 or more sciences, because as we'll see next week, when we look at the path of the true seeker, the prerequisites of the true seeker, and Baha'u'llah goes through, I don't have them here, when Baha'u'llah goes through and says purity of heart and not backbiting and all those things, if you enumerate them, you come up with 20. So it's almost as though Baha'u'llah is giving, he's saying, Karim Khan said, you needed these 20 things, but let me show you the actual 20 things you need. And we'll talk about those 20 things next week. So this guy also claimed to be an alchemist. Baha'u'llah mentioned this, said he calls upon the people to prove this science, because Karim Khan himself was unable to do so. He takes him to task for his claims of knowledge, and says that's one of the most grievous veils, and upon its ashes we've reared the tabernacle of divine knowledge. This is repeating something Baha'u'llah said earlier. This is from part 1 of the Iqan from a few weeks ago, where he says knowledge is of two kinds, divine and satanic. It's paragraph 76. He says knowledge, and he quotes a hadith that knowledge is the most grievous veil between man and his creator. So and then he concludes his discussion of Karim Khan by saying where to go and where to find and how to be the source of true knowledge. He says a divine mind only can yield the gems of divine knowledge, and the fragrance of the mystic flower can be inhaled only in the ideal garden, and the lilies of ancient wisdom can blossom nowhere except in the city of a stainless heart. And next week we'll talk about all the prerequisites of cleansing that heart so that it can be the fertile field in which these flowers of knowledge will bloom. So this is just recapitulating major themes. Again, this is all in the context of loosely of the twofold stations of the manifestations. We saw some more symbolic interpretations. We had a little bit of a digression on the infinity of creation, how that makes all of our theologies too small to fit, to be absolute and to be all-encompassing. And we had a nice digression on significance of one's countenance and bearing. And also we talked about the relativity of religious knowledge and its implications for what we think it is that the prophet is transmitting to us in their verses and parables, and how we need to find some way to abstract above that to see the unity behind it. So that's it. Next week, March 25th, we're going to skip 1 week for those who are listening and not here live, taking 1 week off, 2 weeks off for the fast. And then we will be looking at paragraphs 211 to 245. This will be the spiritual prerequisites of the true seeker and the word of God is greatest proof. The following week, April 1st, will be class 8 and the final class. And so we'll go all the way up to the end, 245 to the end on that final week, up to 85.